Hello everyone. This is just the second video lecture on chapter 1 on the history of psychology, and I just wanted to talk briefly about the branches of psychology. Really, it's kind of an overview about what we're going to be learning about in this chapter. Um, so there's many different branches in the field of psychology. A lot of times when we think of psychology or psychologists, we think of a clinical psychologist that does counseling and sees patients in their office. But honestly, the majority of psychologists actually do research and really work at understanding the human mind and really perfecting our understanding of the human mind. So many of these areas we're going to be studying about throughout the chapters too. My next slide will show you what chapters we're going to be covering in the book. But one of the first chapters we'll be covering is biopsychology. And this is how our biological functions actually impact our psychological functions. So it really looks at how biology affects us psychologically, how our brain anatomy affects us psychologically, how our nervous system impacts us psychologically. So it's a really interesting field. There is a chapter on sensation and perception, which doesn't really seem like psychology to me to a certain degree, but sensation is really understanding our sense of smell, our sense of hearing, our sense of taste. And the psychology of that is perception. How do we put all that information from our senses together and make sense of it and respond to that information? So it's a really interesting field of psychology as well. Cognitive psychology really looks at our thought processes, how our mind actually works, how do we problem solve, lots of different areas of cognitive psychology. How do we measure intelligence? So there is a chapter on cognitive psychology that we'll talk about. Developmental psychology looks at how do we change as we grow from infancy to adulthood? How is a child different than an adolescent in their ability to think? We know there's physical differences, but what are the psychological differences? The maturity level, the thinking abilities, how are they different? Personality psychology is how do we measure somebody's personality that we don't know very well? How can we assess somebody's personality really quickly and understand somebody's personality really quickly? And then there's also industrial organizational psychology. Oh, this last one here is social psychology. I need to move my this over a little bit. Industrial organizational psychology is a chapter in the book, but we're not actually going to cover it because we only have 15 weeks in this class because of spring break. And I'm sure you guys would rather have spring break than learn about industrial organizational psychology. But what that looks at is, how can we help employees be happier at work, healthier, more motivated at work? A lot of stuff we don't really think about employers doing, but it's really an interesting field of psychology. Health psychology, how does our psychological health affect our physical health? Sports psychology is a really exciting field. We do have a class on sports psychology, but I'm not sure if it is offered very often. But how can we help athletes be more successful? If you're a quarterback and you throw an interception, how do you recover from that psychologically quickly so that you can get right back into the game? So there's a lot of psychology in sports that you might not think about. Forensic psychology is the study of criminal behavior, lying and lie detection, really interesting area of psychology, and we do have a forensic psychology class on campus here. Educational psychology might not be one you think of, but school psychologists that look at learning disabilities and developmental delays and how to help children in educational settings. So these are many different fields that psychologists study in psychology. So these are all the chapters that we're going to be covering this semester. And actually, like I said, we're not covering industrial or an organizational psychology, but we will study brain anatomy and brain functioning and how it relates to us psychologically. States of consciousness is one of my favorite chapters, and we will talk about substance abuse, we'll talk about alcohol abuse, we'll talk about drug abuse, substance abuse. We'll also talk about sleep and dreaming that are usually really interesting. Learning is a chapter on behaviorism, and we will talk about a lot of the behavioral principles and how those principles are being used to manipulate us in social media, and advertising all around. So it's a really interesting chapter. It doesn't sound very interesting, but it really is. Thinking and intelligence, cognition and intelligence really looks at how does our mind work and also how do we measure intelligence. Memory, we'll learn some memory techniques and skills. And a lot of these we've already kind of talked about. Motivation and emotion is a really interesting chapter. And social psychology looks at, how do we behave differently in the presence of others, which is kind of interesting. um, do people act differently in the presence of a teacher, in the presence of your boss at work, in the presence of your parents or your friends? Yeah, we all behave very differently. And are there different social situations that could influence us to behave in a bad way or in a different way than we normally would have had we not been in that particular social situation? So it's a really interesting thing that we're going to look at. And 14 is a good chapter on stress and health, and we're going to look at how our stress levels affect our health and what kind of things that we can do to really improve our physical health and psychological health. And then the final two chapters we'll cover will be on psychological disorders and treatment. And this, of course, is our book, and this is the OpenStax app that you can find on your phone. It's free, and you can get your textbook on the phone, and it has some pretty good a glossary and some good extra information both in the textbook and in the app. I think you have exactly the same information in the app and the textbook. But anyway, I don't want to go on too long. I just wanted to give you a sense of what we'll be covering this semester, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lecture.